created to have some fun together, sharing and singing. So, join and enjoy.
Our love for opera brings us together. Thanks for being with us in this trip.
Hello again. Thank you very much for joining us for another of our programs on the subject of Maria Callas Centennial. But before we get there, I wanted to share with you a couple of comments. I wanted to give you a couple of updates of what's been going on with opera we love singing that I am going to call today a project. I am pretty sure that almost nobody in our audience is aware that the opera we love singing is a component of a larger project that is in fact called Opera en Primera Persona. That is, the name is in Spanish. So this project or this group of projects was born almost 5 years ago, takes us very close to the years of pandemics, and there are several components that are were live presentations and other audiovisual materials, and only Opera Wheel of Singing has been the latest of it in the podcast format. And I am saying this because in the early days there were materials in the web that used to be updated, but truly is that when we started the podcast, it consumed all the time resources that Katya and I had, and so eventually all the websites and the contact were never updated again. So information there is old. I took a look at those in the past weeks. I'm not very happy of what was there, and so I have been in conversations with Katia, and we will be updating and redoing some of those things. And we are also planning on building a more direct way to interact with you because of what we have read in your emails. You would like to hear to understand a little more of what is Katia about, what she's been working, what are her favorite roles. And I have also read a couple of mails that I shared with her where I don't think I would call them it's a complaint, but that you call our attention to the fact that we never share anything about ourselves. And there is a reason for that, and I would like to take up a couple of minutes to explain. And that is because when we created or we worked on this latest project of the Opera Wheel of Singing podcast, we decided that we didn't want to make it that personal because for us the most important message to convey here is Oprah. We, of course, provide our comments, our thoughts, our perspectives, but this is not a place where Katia is planning to showcase where she's having a presentation, when she's actually doing it, what role she's been working on recently, or anything related to the singing lessons that she has with a good number of students, or my personal projects. I am not sharing any of those because we would distract the attention of the main message in the podcast, that is music and the love and the passion that we have for the artists, for the operas, and for the maestros. That is the reason for that. Of course, we understand that by doing so, somehow there is sort of a distance between the voices that you hear and how much you can actually relate to the people who are behind those voices and how much you would like to learn from us. So you will notice that in the podcast, there will be some changes at the beginning and at the end of it. A much more warmer opening coming real soon, and we will be doing something also with the. I know that most of the listeners are not actually listening it from the native service that we are paying, which is Buzzsprout. Most of you are coming either from Google Podcasts. In fact, Google and Spotify, as of now, are 80% of our listeners. To my surprise, because Google started very low, 2% a year ago. Now they account for over 40%. So very interesting to see how the numbers have been growing and the number of countries actually now growing, which is another of the reasons of why I was having this conversation with Katia on how we could be more interacting with you and because we would love to hear from the many countries that are now listening to us. We know that there are cultural differences, there are language differences. I was sharing with her, uh, and it will be part of the Callas cycle in a couple of months, that for us it is very important the recordings that we have on from Maria Callas in her live performances in Bellas Artes. But she was sharing with me that maybe, or in many of the countries that you are listening to us now, you don't have an opera house where you didn't have the fortune of having artists of the size of Maria Callas attending your countries. If we are very sincere, the top singers are usually around 8 to 10 opera houses in the world. And with the number of countries that we have in the world, that means that more of 90% of the world has never had a chance of listening to the most important artists in the opera for the past century. Even if they travel extensively, if they come to Latin America, they will go to Mexico, Argentina, and maybe Brazil. But what happens with Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and the other many countries that we have in Latin America? If they go to Europe, they will certainly go to the Royal Opera House. They may stop at the Teatro de la Zarzuela in Spain. They may not. They will hardly now go to Portugal. They will certainly go to Salzburg Festival if that is their chance. They would go to Paris, but what happens with the many other countries in Europe? With that in mind, is that we would also like to keep a much closer communication with you. You will get many news from us often. We're planning on maybe there is a link that will take you to our page that is not updated, that it is not in very good conditions now, but that will change in the following weeks and months. In the Buy Me a Coffee, we have a profile there that we will be updating. Not to yeah, not to ask you to pay for a membership because we will be not, the main purpose is not to push you into buying or having a membership yourself, but to allow to have more posts more often and that you would be able to reply to them. I still keep in mind if you're listening to our programs in order, you noticed that in the program for Maestro Offenbach, I mentioned that we got an email where you were telling us that you are not a native speaker of English and that you found it very difficult to use Google Translator and to get a result that was poor in English and that the message would not be properly conveyed. That you, many, and I understand, provided the huge number of countries that are listening to us now, out of those 74 countries, I am pretty sure that not even 10 are native speakers of English. So you may be able to understand through our program, but reading or even writing can be more challenging. So we will work our way around that. I understand. I really want to insist. I understand that many of you, even if you want to write us an email, are hesitant to do it because of language barrier, but hopefully, in the weeks to come, we will have a way to work around it. So keep your eyes on the podcast. You will listen to the changes, those additions soon. I will insist on the Boss Sprout landing page that I will be changing soon, and the materials that Katya and I are planning to add to the Buy Me a Coffee. So good news or more things to come in this 2024 moving forward, but I think that is enough for the messages that I wanted to share with you. It is time for us now to start talking about, in this our fifth program on the subject of the Maria Callas Centennial. We're having back with us Sophia Lambton. Thank you very much for joining us again, Sophia. And Privet, how how is everything going with this book of yours, the Callas Imprint? I was fortunate to be. I'm pretty sure I was one of the first readers of the book, and
Yeah, you
There are a good number of things that really caught my attention, but I wanted to start with what maybe could be the beginning. When was the first time that you heard Callas? What was your first impression?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me back, Ricardo. Because of Ricardo, I have got slightly used to recording for podcasts, although it still feels odd. But thank you for letting me be here. The first time I heard Callas has had nothing to do with the book, which would come later. But when I was 13 years old, at first, my father gave me a CD of, I mentioned this last podcast, so sorry for repeating this. My father gave me a CD of Leontine Price singing Carmen, and then he gave me the Callas recording. And when you're that young, or I don't know, maybe if you're a young singer, you know better. But when you are a young music lover who up to that point had not really listened to much opera at all, when I was 13, I was a pretty regular 13-year-old for the most part. So I was listening to Britney Spears and Gwen Stefani and Alicia Keys. But I was slowly getting into classical music. I went backwards in history. So I went through a Sinatra period, and I still love Cole Porter songs, Gershwin songs. And then I went into classical music. So I went backwards chronologically. And I listened to Leontine Price singing Carmen. And when I listen to it now, I don't like it that much. But back then I thought, oh, this is a cool Carmen. This is the way it's supposed to be. So when I then listened to the Callas Carmen, I thought, I don't like this. The voice is too dark and, unusual. But I found that happens, well, not so much now that I'm older. So I understand that different can mean good. But when you're that young, things like voices, especially, or sometimes even actors who perform in a way that is very, very unconventional, that can seem off putting to somebody who really is so inexperienced listening to opera or even watching a different kind of movie or reading a different kind of book in terms of getting used to new voices in writing, you know? So, uh, it took, I don't know, maybe it took about 2 weeks for me to get used to the Callas voice. But once I did, I do remember that I loved the Callas voice. And I remember when I was 16 years old, spending a lot of time listening to the French arias. So the ones we discussed on our last Callas podcast, Printemps qui commence, Mon cœur suivra ta voix, so de Sanson et Dalila.
Hmm.
And later on I had different albums. I in the beginning I didn't have the full operas. I just buy studio recordings and duet albums, because I think it's partly because I grew up listening to pop music, and when you're listening to pop icons, there's no opera, so you're buying albums of different songs. And at first, when I started to love opera, I wanted to collect all the soloists' albums. So I remember Anna Netrebko had a Russian album, and Dina Nata had a Handel album, and she had an album called Isabella Colburn the Muse. And it took me a while to realize that actually, when Callas was alive, they did come out with different names, but they've also been rebranded and renamed over the years. So my Callas albums are from the early, mid, late 2000s. But since then, I don't even know if they've been re-released, but they don't have the same names. So I listened to the duets with Di Stefano. I remember listening a lot to the Puritani duet with Di Stefano, to a lot of Trovatore, D'Amor sulle Rose. But I wouldn't know what year it came from. And at that point, I wasn't able to tell which is the better recording, which is the worst recording. So I spent a long time loving Callas before it ever occurred to me that I would ever write anything substantial about her.
And that was my next question. At what point do you, because I am very interested in that, and I think that our listeners may as well. At what point you decide I'm going to put this huge effort, because I understand, and I'm pretty sure our listeners understand that as well, that putting together a biographical book is really hard work. So at some point, you made a decision of, hey, I'm going to go ahead and write a book on Callas. How do you come to that decision?
I came to that decision completely fortuitously because I'm not a nonfiction writer. Well, no, I should say I am a classical music critic. And that happened partly on account of Callas. But in the beginning and throughout my life, I've mostly been a fiction writer. So when I was 14, I wrote my first play, which was terrible. And then I wrote another play and another play. And I thought I'd be a playwright. But then what happened was I was 17 years old. So I was in the last year at high school. Uh, and really stressed out actually because you're applying to universities and I was working. I mean, I was going to bed at 3 or 4 a.m. every day and getting 3 or 4 hours of sleep. And I started, I think YouTube, maybe the YouTube algorithms decided my fate because either a Callas interview came on, and this would probably have been the Lord Harwood 1968 interviews for the BBC. And I started listening to her, and I remember feeling very surprised because I only knew of Callas what Wikipedia told me, pretty much, right? And I mean, depending on obviously the source you consult, most of the mainstream sources online are very vague, even if they seem like they're full of details about people. You really don't know a person, especially if that person died a long time ago and was very famous, but you really don't know anyone until you've seen or heard them speak or read their correspondence. So any descriptions, you might watch a documentary and see a friend saying, "Oh, I remember when she told me this," but that's nothing compared to watching and hearing Maria Callas speak. And I remember relating to what she was saying about opera production today, even though she was saying it in 1968, which is that there are people who don't really care about the intentions of the composer. There are directors who want to impose their own concepts onto operas that were not written with anything similar to that concept in mind. And I was feeling this back then as a very young opera lover, who at the time was not a critic, but I would have shortly become one. I wrote my first review for a magazine in November 2010. That was Adriana Lecouvreur with Angela Gheorghiu at the Royal Opera House. Most of what I knew about singing would come from listening to interviews with Maria Callas, mostly with Lord Harwood, but later on also with other interviewers like Edward Downes and I think his name was Harry Fleetwood and Edward Murrow and all the famous Callas interviews, because luckily for us, they are on YouTube. Pretty much all of them. There are very few Callas interviews that aren't on YouTube. And if they're not, you can order them on a CD, on eBay or Amazon if you live in a country where those are available. And I'm sure that even if you don't, you have sites where you live where they would be available, Abbey Books as well. So what actually happened was I fell in love with this creature whom I did not know. I had heard her recordings, but I didn't really know who she was because I was under the same impression as very many other people out there, which is, oh, Maria Callas was this diva. She was very argumentative. She threw tantrums. She behaved in a spoiled, selfish way. She had this big affair. That was what I thought. It was completely incorrect. It was a completely incorrect assumption. And, it completely changed me as a person, not just from the perspective of beginning to write this biography, research at first, but also because I realized, how many artists out there are being misrepresented? If you do a Google search, it can result in a few good photos of someone. And if you're lucky, you might find good YouTube clips, but it's not really that much. So at first she inspired my first novel, which was terrible, which I'm not going to talk about because it was awful. But that was before I really knew her well. So eventually, during that last year of school, I did throw around a few ideas in my head of wanting to write something about her. But it wasn't until the end of 2011, so I was at my first year at university, that I thought, I'm going to make it a proper chronological biography, which hadn't occurred to me because I knew it would entail a lot of work. I didn't know how much work it would entail back when I was a student. I was very lucky because I was young and stupid. And when you're young and stupid, life seems a lot easier than it actually is, as I learned later on.
And I think that maybe we haven't insisted enough in our previous programs, but there is something about Maria Callas, and our listeners know that we always want to adhere to the professional side of singers because there is already too much gossiping. And in a way, there are there are two opposite. I would say if you wanted to paint it black and white, there is way too much in the white side. There is way too much fanaticism around Maria. People who would take anything she sang as a top performance, even when, as we shared in the last program, her the duos that she sang with Di Stefano in the 70s
Mhm.
are really not good in general, except for a couple of exceptions. They are not really good. But in one hand, you have those followers who would die defending that she was always at her best and refusing to take any criticism on the quality of her performances. And you have on the other side the other people who only care about her life and analysis, if she married to Meneghini, if she ever got pregnant, and all those things that even though one can easily at some point separate it because that is her personal life. At the end, I think that the two of them actually do not let us see Maria for the artist she was, because taking or
Mhm.
thinking uh, that she did everything to perfection is not good, and thinking that she was only material for those gossips in the media is also that bad. So I wanted to ask you on that subject. How did you picture putting the message or conveying the message on Maria Callas? Because the easy way is to just, to add everything and using those adjectives of in that marvelous performance of June, year, blah, 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 where she did the most outrageous, and adding way too many adjectives to just feed on what the those people who idealize Maria would read, or go to the other extreme and just putting together all the gossiping that was around in the magazines in those years. And also, you could also get away with something that maybe people would read. But I think you did something different, and I know it because I just finished your book this week. I
Oh,
know
that's
you
great.
did something different. Tell us a little about that spirit or the purpose of your book.
Well, thank you, Ricardo, for telling me I did something different because that was the objective from the very beginning. Even though I was very young when I started, I didn't really know what I was going to do, except that I wanted it to be a biography. So there are several points to make here. Um, so the first is the problem I find with most biographies, not just of Callas, but especially of people as famous or popular as Callas, is that regardless of whether they're conveying facts or lies or just interpretations of things that are questionable, they have this tone throughout. And the problem with many Callas biographies is that many of them are hostage to their own tone. So they're captive to a particular, it's not just an idea, it's something, if someone thinks she had a very tragic life, maybe the biographer will pick all of the negative criticisms she faced. If, on the other hand, somebody thinks Callas was inconquerable and, flawless, then the writer will ignore everything negative that ever happened in her life. If, on the other hand, it's a scholar, there have been some academic people, people with PhDs who've written more academic books, then it can lead to a rather dry analysis of her performance, regardless of whether it was good or bad. And maybe because I'm a novelist at heart. So I am also a very, very vivid writer. So I knew I wanted to include very little details, meaning the things that make up daily life. What did she have for breakfast? What did she have for lunch? Whom did she talk to? Did she go shopping that day? As much as I could find out. And of course, it's very difficult when you write a biography because you have many, many restrictions. I did not want to make up conversations because previous biographers have made up dialogues. And people still do that today. And I think it's wrong. I think unless you have a very good reason to believe there was a particular dialogue between two people, maybe a friend quoted it, even that could be inaccurate, and probably is if it was many years after the fact. Unless you really have a correspondence that is letters that you're reading and you can quote it exactly, you can't just make up dialogues. At the same time, I wanted really to immerse my readers into a colorful, vivid world that is real. Meaning, it's not just about let's look at this recording, and it's not just about let's look at why Callas and Meneghini broke up. It's not that. It's I'm going to take you through her eyes. So there are going to be all kinds of banal details, like Callas gets the Asian flu. Callas has, a dispute with her sister, but there are also going to be those transfigurative performances that completely they're timeless. And I describe her voice, so you don't have to be familiar with the recording. You don't have to know opera very well, and that's what I've been telling a lot of people. Thankfully, I've actually had some nice positive feedback from people who've not only never attended an opera, but they've never listened to a full opera, even on YouTube or Spotify. Because it's about creating art. It's about, are you interested in what it's like being an artist, and being an artist trying to do something to perfection? Because artists who are, especially as romantic as Maria Callas was, and by romantic, I mean wanting to do things to the highest possible degree of perfection, not the highest possible degree of quality, but of perfection. You want things to be as beautiful as possible in the world, but everybody is restrained by real life, and you can't ignore that. You can't just pretend Callas was this great performer and there weren't unpleasantries in her life. There were plenty of nasty events, and unfortunately, people behaved badly. So you can't ignore that. So it really tries to take you through moments, as many moments as I could find. And if you're talking about the texture of my book, I would get all the little details about, okay, what happened during this 1958 November Medea? That's the Dallas Medea, after which she'd received the telegram before. Telegram from Rudolph Bing, who then was artistic director of the Met, saying, you're fired. And it was because of this misunderstanding that had taken place between Callas and Rudolph Bing, and also in part her husband Giovanni Battista Meneghini, who was also her manager then. So that's a long story, but I detailed all the telegrams and messages up to that, but not in full, because I don't want to bore you with just transcribing messages, but the most important vital details. And then what happened on that day, when she was rehearsing before, a pillar on stage almost fell on her. She rehearsed until 2 or 2:30 a.m. I think it was 2:30 a.m. She was so panicky about getting a cold that because this was months after the famous Rome walkout, where Callas was feeling very, very ill and had to suspend her performance midway. She had the chairman of the Dallas Opera or something, and somebody else mop the floors because she was scared there would be dust and she would catch a cold. There were problems with the costume, and then she comes on stage and the audience is terrified, and we hear her being that rabid monster of Medea. She announces herself, Io son Medea. So I would collate as many details about every single production as possible, regardless of whether it had been recorded, and also about the studio recordings. How did the studio recording go? There's a funny moment where the French writer Réal La Rochelle, who wrote 3 books about Callas's recordings in French, showed up at the recording of Carmen in 1964, and she was very insecure about it, and she asked him, oh, but weren't you supposed to come yesterday? Or there's this interesting exchange between them. So it's not just alternating between private life and professional life, because those things mix. I mean, Meneghini, her husband, would be in the wings wishing her good luck. This is life. Everything, it's a collage, but it's in chronological order, and I have made tremendous effort to make it interesting. So another thing I would do, you asked about my approach. I have several folders with subfolders for this, obviously. I'm sure all biographers do. So there was something called neat transcription, and those were my folders containing everything I could find that was remotely new. Everything, about everything. And they were in chronological order. However, there were also many details I wanted to incorporate that weren't confined to an era, like, was Callas religious? What kind of food did Callas like? What kind of TV did Callas watch? What kind of movies did she like? Who were her favorite actors? What kind of jewelry did she like? What was she like in friendships? Was she a good friend? Was she a bad friend? Did that depend on the period in her life? Was she stingy? Was she not stingy? Was she generous? All of these questions that you cannot confine to 1952 or 1967. So I made a separate list. I called it a skeletal arrangement. And I listed her characteristics. And then I planned, okay, where am I going to discuss Callas's favorite cities, or how well Callas spoke different languages, or how well she wrote letters, because she actually had quite poor grammar and not very good spelling. Where am I going to discuss this? Should I put this closer to the beginning? Should I put this closer to the end? And obviously, most of those central characteristics ended up scattered across the first probably 7 or 8 chapters, because you grow up and you become an evolved person, but of course people change. So then I had to trace those changes, characteristic changes. When people are getting older, a lot of people as they age, especially, well, not so much Callas because she died at 53. However, we know she lost her voice. So that was a very slow degenerative process that caused her a lot of pain. How is her behavior changing on account of that? How is her approach to music? How is her approach to rehearsals changing? That's also a difficult thing to pinpoint to a time. So I did my best to disperse all of these details. I must admit, I didn't read a manual about how to write a biography. I have obviously read biographies, but I never read about the biography writing process. I don't know how this differs from what other biographers do, because the problem when you're writing biography is you're writing a chronology, but you're also writing a character, right? It's a psychography. You want to find out who is this person. And you also don't want to take up too much time saying, well, this is what so-and-so thinks, but it contrasts with what other so-and-so thinks, because some other biographers have done that. So it was an enormous challenge. And I also, I don't want to ramble on too long, but on top of all of that, I still have a massive chronology it's a table of the 19,616 days of Maria Callas's life. And I hope I calculated it correctly, but I calculated it, I think, 10 and a half years ago. So every single day of Callas's life, do I know something that happened on that day? And a lot of days are very, very full, especially at the peak of her career. And generally anytime from 1912, I mean, from about 49 to her death, you've got a lot of full days. But of course, she wasn't performing at all in the last 2, well, you can pretty much say 3 years, because November 74 is the last performance. So almost 3 years. And she didn't perform in 66 or 67. 69, she filmed Medea. So yeah, there are some blank days, but to be honest, not very many. So I did try to outline something for every day if I could. And I remember thinking, okay, I don't have that much on 66, so I made special efforts with 66. And I ended up filling a lot of I mean, I would say probably most days definitely from 52 onwards. I could tell you where she was. I could tell you what she was doing. I could tell you if she'd written a letter. If she'd written a letter or a few, I could tell you what was in them. Not offhand necessarily. I don't know it all off by heart. But yeah, it was an exhaustive process, exhaustive and exhausting. But it's very important to know that. It's very important to have context. So if you take a Callas interview, it's very important to know what led up to that interview. Do I know anything about her relationship with that interviewer? For instance, she was very polite to David Frost, and when you listen to the interview, it doesn't seem like she's frustrated by the fact that he's asking her questions on her relationship with Onassis and her private life. But then actually afterwards, she wrote in a letter, the nerve of David Frost to ask me such questions. And all of these things, they add to the details. They give you context, and context is everything when you're writing a biography.
And also at some point, this journey, I would like to call it a journey, because it comes a point when you decide, I'm going to write a book. You start gathering information, putting some order into it, but also you learn more about the subject of your book. Maria Callas is the subject. I wanted to mention it because I recall also in the project of Opera Primera Persona, there was a cycle of songs of a Mexican composer under the name Maria Grieber, great Mexican composer, beautiful music that she wrote. So that was I really engaged into watching, reading, understanding the music from a different perspective. So I can say that the Maria Grieber I thought I knew before engaging into this, and the Maria Grieber that I think I know now that I accomplished that project is very different. I I now feel that I understand why is the accent? Why did she compose that song like that? What are the words? How do they relate to what she was actually living in those horrible years of the 1920s? Everything starts to make sense. So even if you are a professional, in your case, gathering facts and watching interviews and reading letters and putting all that information together so that it can be conveyed to the reader, you still at some point feel like you're building some sort of relationship with the subject of your book. How would you describe that journey in learning and understanding, Maria?
Oh, well, you ask very, very deep question, Ricardo. Oh my God. There was quite a journey. It's quite a journey. And my relationship with her, because as you probably know, given your own experience, if you spend a long time researching somebody, it is not the experience of a fan. So I tell people, well, yeah, of course I love Maria Callas, but I wouldn't call myself a super fan. Because as Ricardo, as you mentioned before, there are some fans who think that a performer can do no wrong. And there are some fans who think, oh, this interview is wonderful, this photo is wonderful, this video is wonderful. But on the contrary, if you truly care about somebody, as you do your friend or your brother or your sister, or even your aunt or your cousin, there are going to be things that irritate you. There are going to be moments where you think, wait a second, you're contradicting yourself. You just said this and now you're saying that. Why are you changing what you said? Has something happened that affected your perspective? So, as I've mentioned in previous episodes of this podcast, there are recordings that I don't like of Callas. There are recordings where I feel like I'm hearing more Maria Callas, the anxious performer, than the character she's playing. And there are interviews where I feel she's very, very tense. And there are moments. Okay, so there are captures of her that get on my nerves because I know that she's being defensive or she's contradicting herself, and that's very difficult when you're analyzing someone to figure out why is somebody contradicting themselves. So at the beginning, I think I was much more the super fan, which is not to say I thought all her recordings were great, because I've never thought that about anybody. But I would say that at the beginning, I was more inclined to take what she was saying at face value, and that was very difficult because she contradicts herself, especially as we get into the mid 60s and more so, very, very, very much so in the 70s. So you can't take someone at face value when they contradict themselves. So something I actually learned as a result of studying Callas, but also through studying other people, because I have studied other individuals and artists, but I don't wish to write a biography of those people. That's just, I have a natural curiosity. So Callas is by far not the only person I've studied. And I thought of this thing about 10 years ago. In self-contradiction, there is truth, which basically means if someone is contradicting themselves, they have a sore spot. That's not that. I mean, even that is an interesting thing, because sometimes Maria Callas, for instance, might be hiding something or just being a bit defensive. So that's another problem. But for instance, if you trace Callas's relationship with her voice, you've got her owning up to problems to herself as early as 54, much more so in 57, 58, especially 59. And then once she's doing the concert tour with Di Stefano, there's an interview with her with David Holmes for BBC in 1973 saying, oh, but I'm singing much better today than I was 8 years ago. And anyone who has heard Callas from 65 and especially 64, the Toscas and even the Pirate Normas, knows that Callas was not singing better in 1973 or 4 than she was then. And she was singing much worse. So why is that happening? Well, partly because she's in denial, partly because she is giving an interview for the BBC and she is quite proud in this context. She doesn't want to seem too vulnerable. So all of these things took a long time to figure out. And in the meantime, I think from a personal view, I had to grow up and realize that there were things about Maria Callas that irritated me, because that's just the way relationships are, even if you never met the person. if you know a lot about a person, there's no such thing as 100% thinking they're perfect, right? And I had to realize she was less like me than I had thought as an 18 or 19-year-old. Because when you're that age, at least when I was that age, it's all about, oh, I want to find a role model. I want to relate to somebody, identify with somebody who is that talented. But we do have a lot of stuff not in common, not least of which is her taste in men. Her also, even I would say, her taste in films, her behavior as a friend. So she could be quite a good friend, but to be honest, she was not always the best friend in her friendship. She was not always a very devoted friend, and she was quite open about that. She would say, sometimes I don't call my friends for a long time, and they know that, and they accept me as I am. So it was a process of, I suppose, mentally trying to detach myself enough so that I wouldn't be wanting her to be somebody, because that's what everybody does. If you're in, it doesn't matter what kind of relationship you're in, whether it's romantic or a friendship or even maybe a work relationship. Everybody is ultimately, I'm going to sound quite existential here, but we're all alone in our own consciousness. And we're all constantly trying to project our own feelings or thoughts onto other people, especially if we feel a closeness to them, if we feel similarities with them. And there were things about Maria Callas I had to realize. Also, from the artistic perspective, in the beginning, I was listening to her talk about conductors, and I thought, well, if anybody knows about conductors, it's Maria Callas, But yes, that is true to an extent. But also, do I ever listen to Tullio Serafin's recordings that aren't with Callas? No, I don't. It would never occur to me to look for, I want to look for Falstaff conducted by Tullio Serafin. I don't know if Tullio Serafin conducted Falstaff, but Callas didn't sing it. So I don't know. I know about Tullio Serafin from the Callas perspective because she thought he was a master. Was he a master? Yes, he was. He was a master with singers. He was he was a mentor. He was a tutor. But Karajan is the far superior conductor, whereas Callas had issues with him. So it also took me a while to evolve as a classical music lover and critic and realize, well, the fact that Maria Callas thinks she thought, for instance, that George Schell was not a very good conductor, which I happen to kind of relate to because I don't particularly like Schell's recordings. But, the fact that Maria Callas has a judgment about a conductor or a composer or a fellow singer doesn't make it true just because it's Maria Callas, So it was a very, very long process of learning. There are really 3 stages. You are finding out about the person, which takes a long time. You're getting used to the person. And, the best stage I don't know if you can call this advice, but if you are if anyone out there is going to write a biography or even a PhD and is exploring a person, whether it's just their art or their private life as well, the best stage you can come to is when this person is boring you. Because that means you feel like you know the person. So, which is not to say that Maria Callas bores me, but, I know so much about her that when I was later on discovering less as I hadn't before, it was all kind of predictable to me. Because, yeah, you're going to say that in this period, because I know what you're going to say in this particular period, even if it contrasts with what you would have said in that period. So there's the finding out stage. There's the getting used to stage. And then there's kind of the resigned stage of, okay, I feel like I have my material. Now I really have to arrange it in such a way so that it's appealing and entertaining and informative and enlightening to readers, or whatever the case may be, if you're filming a documentary or, I don't know, producing a radio program. So I guess 3 stages there.
And that leads me to a question that I have been willing to ask you for already a good number of weeks already, on the name of your book, because many people may not be aware of that, but to say, okay, I am having my radio show. How am I going to name it? Is it important? I could tell you from my own experience, it really is important on what words you choose. And you chose the Callas Imprint. Why is that? What is your rationale for naming your book?
Yeah, it took a while. I think the first title was an imprint on history, which was a bit too much because, though of course Callas is very important for our history of opera and music, relative to world history, there are more significant people, as in there are people who've had a much greater influence on the course of history and things like revolutions and civil wars and democracies breaking or democracies rising. So that was too grandiose. I think at one point it was an imprint on the world, which was also a bit crazy because Callas only sung in a certain number of countries. So yeah, the Callas imprint sounded to me, it was succinct, and it also referenced her legacy, which is what we're talking about. Her legacy is what we're doing right now. We're talking about Maria Callas. There were tons of sopranos around then, mezzos, tenors, baritones, basses, that we're not, well, you might discuss them, Ricardo, because you have an opera podcast. But unfortunately, or fortunately, most podcast hosts are not going to discuss them or even reference them. This is what she has left behind. Thankfully, I do believe there are still, well, at least hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people worldwide who understand she was a genius, who understand that she was a great and a tremendous rarity. And it was very important for me to make that felt and heard. I felt like it was a name that people can... The Callas imprint it's much catchier than, The Life of Maria Callas. And most of those kinds of titles have already been used anyway. A life, art and life. Well, yes, but every single performer and creator has an art and has a life. And also they're not distinct either. They're very, intermeshing, overlapping. So what is it about? Well, what I'm doing, what I did reflects her imprint. And then it does have a subtitle, which is a Centennial biography, because it came out to coincide with her centenary. And that wasn't originally planned. When I was younger, I thought I'd do it much more quickly, but that didn't happen. And I think by the time I realized how long it would take, I thought, well, I may as well release it on her centenary to give myself ample opportunity. And it still felt like a ton of work to do in the period. Though I will say, of course, yes, I did spend 12 years working on it, but obviously in those 12 years, I wasn't just working on it. I was working on other books. And I also tutor French and Latin, so I was doing that. So it's not that I, spent 12 years every day on it. Far from it, especially the last few years where it was mostly editing and proofreading, eventually selecting photos, and eventually designing the book cover. Well, or rather directing the design with my fabulous book cover designer, Renee Clark. I've lost why did I call it that? Yeah, because it's catchy. And I think people understand what it means. And it is what it says. It's her imprint, it's her legacy, it's what she's left behind.
And I think it is very interesting that you went for that choice of words, because I gave lots of thought on that, because I was asking myself, Ricardo, if you were asked what is Callas imprint, what would you say? And so I really gave lots of thought to that. And one of my takeaways was uh, a professional way of being an artist. Because lots is said about the problems that she had with all the major opera houses and all that stuff. But the truth is that when you read, when you have access, or when you understand what was really going on in her mind, most of the times I would agree. I mean, when she says, I don't want to be on that Lucia because that oil tank in the middle of the stage.
Yeah,
I mean,
it looks like an oil tank.
the only thing.
A well, it's a well. The well in the,
the well in the first scene. Yeah, right, that one.
Yeah.
For people who are familiar with Lucia de la Mermur, and it is a very beautiful aria, which, by the way, she's one of the, and I think she's the only artist that I have heard that correlates that scene from Lucia to the aria in Il Trovatore for Maestro Verdi, two different composers, and she says, hey, pay attention. And it is true. When you're a singer, you notice that it is also the the presentation aria for the soprano in the first act, even almost with the same duration, and the main part and the cavatina right after that. So it is true that Donizetti and Verdi did something similar, and she points to that. Personally, I have not heard any other soprano pointing at that. Is it that they have never noticed? Is it that they never cared? Is it that they never paid enough attention to notice that they overlap? And there are a good number of comments, not only that I read in your book, but that I had read or heard or watched before, when I say it is, she is right.
Now,
The
Ricardo, guide me through this. Is this Regnava nel silenzio?
Regnava nel silenzio, yeah.
And you're
That
comparing it to D'amor sulle rose?
No,
Oh,
the
il
Amor sulla
loro
Rosé is at
miserere.
the end. She compares it to the entrance of Leonora in El Trovatore in the first act.
Oh, taci la notte placida.
Tacea la notte placida. Yeah, if you take your time and compare the two of them, you say, hey, they are similarly constructed. In the place that they are in the opera, the type of soprano may be something similar because in the first act Leonora is not singing heavy. Wait for the other acts where she's actually putting all the weight in her voice. But at the beginning, one of the things that frustrates me the most from singers that came after is that they never pay attention to details. And I noticed that Maria
Mhm.
pays attention to many of those details. So that level of professionalism, of understanding your business, is what I would like to see in the many other singers that came after. I'm not pretty sure on what she meant. You mentioned it in your book. I'm not pretty sure on what she meant when she said that she thought Sutherland would follow her path. I'm not sure if she meant in the bel canto, in her conception of the roles, in the depth of understanding of the roles.
I agree. I think it was just one of those because she said I thought Sutherland would follow my path, but she didn't. Isn't that's what she said, right?
Yeah.
That's the phrase. I wanted her to follow my path, but she herself admits she can't. That's the phrase. Um,
And if I wanted to put
yeah.
myself in the shoes of Maria, and
Okay.
because she makes the comment very often, all the trills, the ornaments, the portamentos, everything means something. And when you listen to Sutherland putting way too much in everything, it is very clear that,
Oh yeah.
at least from that perspective, of course she didn't follow that path. And if we were to, some people say that if we were to blame someone, we would blame it on Richard Bonnish, her husband, because
Oh, okay. Interesting.
people say that that would be a different conversation, but people say that uh, she would do whatever he asked her to do, and that it was
Yeah,
his
because
belief.
Ricardo, let me just add there, since we're on Sutherland. In an interview, Callas said, "Who is great, Sutherland? A beautiful instrument." She said she followed my path. The trouble is she didn't. I used embellishments, those fireworks for expression. She uses them for fireworks. So that's what she said 10 years after the quote you just
And
about the
I would
fireworks.
agree to that.
Yeah.
If people have followed the first podcasts, the early podcasts 2 years ago. By the way, I forgot to mention that we started this project 2 years ago. I have mentioned a number of times that I have never felt very satisfied with the art of Sutherland because she just does all those embellishments, all those notes for the only purpose of doing ornaments, not with a purpose, with the clarity that Maria has.
Yeah, I feel
And
the
it
same
is
way. And I have always felt the same way.
and it is very important, at least for me, because when you say, if you would ask Ricardo, what is it in your mind when you think of Maria Callas? Well, the imprint that she left in me is everything that you do needs to have a purpose. If you're making a pause, if
Yes,
you're
absolutely.
keeping the knot for much longer, at least if you are clear that you are doing it And she mentions it in Juilliard. I don't remember with what student, but she mentions it when she says, "Oh, you have to keep the corona for longer because that will be more effective at the end of your aria." But she is aware that she's doing it with the purpose of an impact on the audience. While currently we have many singers that just do it because they can do it. They don't even think of why they're doing it. And so, from my perspective, in a way, Maria was a very, I would say, rational interpreter in the sense that she just wouldn't make it, at least in the mature phase of her career, because we have talked about her early days where she would sing pretty much everything and pretty much very similar in a very similar way. She wouldn't be that mature. She wouldn't have that level of maturity. But when she reaches her peak, you know that she has thought a lot about it. That she has really put herself in the shoes of who is Lucia, who is Tosca, why is Violetta Valerie. What is her state of mind in the second act? Why is she weeping when she's writing the letter to Alfredo? And nowadays, if you are used to watching interviews or documentaries of many other sopranos, there are very few who can barely even tell you what the plot of the opera is. Because they are just like singing pieces, this is my aria, then there is a duet,
Yeah.
a short dialogue, blah blah blah, keep moving. And I feel very sad when I understand that not many people follow that path. There are not many serious singers nowadays, and I think that's why we keep going back to Maria's recordings, because you say after listening to her traviatas, you listen to other traviatas, recent traviatas, very famous traviatas, and you say, there is something missing. I mean, I don't hear Violetta Valerie here. I listen to the same Giorgio that sang this or that, or no matter what role, it's always the same soprano. She's not giving me anything. While when you listen to Maria's most accomplished roles, you say, hey, this is what the composer actually meant. This is what he wanted to emphasize, and it takes a great artist to understand that. If I would have to answer that question, that would be it. My response: a way of doing things on stage, a way of doing things on singing. You may agree or not, but she had it very clear in a number of years what she was after, and I think it's very hard for singers who came later uh, because you will always be compared to La Divina. We have not mentioned that often, but Maria Callas was to many La Divina. So you say, you're going to do it just like La Divina. So you say Norma, you immediately think of La Divina. So it is, of course, Caballés, Norma, but it is always compared to La Divina. And you have Sutherland's and compared to La Divina. And you have this role and compared to La Divina. So I also understand that it is a great weight on the shoulders of the sopranos that came after because they are always being compared to Maria. But if you let me go to a following question, because and somehow you mentioned it earlier. Sometimes people think, hey, but I need to know about opera in order to read this book. Hey, but I don't know about the many other singers that you mentioned in your programs. How am I going to approach to Maria? Who would you say this book is written for? For opera lovers? Who would be that audience who would be reading your book?
So the book isn't designed for opera lovers from the perspective that it's not one of those academic books that expects you to have any prior knowledge. It used to be up until maybe the 2010s, that there were many books about any specialist subject, whether it was opera or, growing plants, where you were expected to be familiar with certain names. Whereas this isn't one of those books that expects you to know who Jussi Björling is or Ellie Ameling. And it's not just because we live in an era where, unfortunately, very, very few people do know who these people are. It's because I wanted it to be for anyone who cares about how art is created, whether you're into painting or films or even TV, or pop music or rock music or even heavy metal. One of the people who reviewed my book and liked it seems to be a heavy metal or rock fan. So it's about that artistic process. It doesn't require any prior knowledge. I also explain terms that are useful and common in opera, like portamento, legato, bel canto. I explain that in the book, but it's not a manual. It's not, it's not a manual of instruction on how you get to understand opera. It does, however, provide a lot of insight that will hopefully let people who are not that familiar with opera get to love it, because there are a lot of people in the world who understand Maria Callas was a genius, even though they are not big opera aficionados. Also, just the details in the book that haven't been revealed before, or that are very, very little known. These are not designed primarily for opera lovers. It's very important to know them, like the fact that Onassis tried to help Callas with her career. He tried to set up a Maria Callas television company with the help of her manager, Sandra Golinsky, so that she would be able to pre-record, because she was so nervous. She found live television recordings so nerve-wracking. He thought this would help her at a time when she was very insecure about her voice in 1960. I discovered that through the correspondence I found between Callas and Sandra Golinsky, which is at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. The fact that Onassis was friends with Karajan, and together they were trying to persuade Callas to do a film of Tosca that she was very, very reluctant to do. There is a whole narrative in this book that has not been told, because unfortunately people are more interested in different kinds of narratives, which is very dramatic narratives, soap opera kind of narratives, and sometimes real life is like that. I will concede that. I'm a novelist, and I've certainly studied all kinds of different individuals, and some individuals, both famous and not, have very, very tragic or soap opera-like lives. But Maria Callas was not one of those people. I think if anybody who's listening, maybe you're listening because it's on in, I don't know, the car of your friend who's an opera fan, but you're not an opera fan. If you have any interest in how anything in the realm of the arts gets made at all, you could be interested in this book, because this is about the effort that goes into the creation of beauty, but also about how you're trying to live life as a human being, where ultimately all of us, all artists, we're a tiny, 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 tiny fraction, even Callas, of a giant legacy of art that persists after we die. And we're constantly trying to live up to that and be worthy of that. So anybody who's listening to this, maybe not even who's interested in arts, in the arts, maybe science, maybe engineering. If you know what it feels like to be a tiny, tiny, tiny piece of a bigger thing you are trying to create, maybe with the help of collaborators, maybe with the help of hundreds or thousands of people, I think you would find something to relate to in Maria Callas and in this book, regardless even of whether you like her voice or not.
And as we're approaching to wrapping up today's program, I also wanted to ask you, if you could have only 3 of her recordings, only 3, what would be those? What would be those 3 recordings that you could take to that isolated island in the middle of the ocean with no more music to listen but those 3 recordings? What would those be?
This is a very cruel question. It's a cruel question, I have to
I
say.
know.
It's terrible. Because then you're deciding, but do I pick the ones that I really, really am familiar with? Because there are some that I've listened to less. The ones you get too used to, eventually you stop listening because you think, okay, I know this recording, I should take a pause from this recording. Anyway, I love the Callas Karajan Butterfly, but I'm not one of those people who's going to go straight and listen to Un Bel Di just because it's so famous. I can't really hear it anymore. Well, I mean, I can, but it's so famous. So I love the love duet with Pinkerton, Bimbo dagli occhi, where she is so bashful. her voice is so small, and she's playing a Japanese geisha, and she's making her consonants sound like what Callas would perceive to be Japanese consonants, so they sound harsher. They sound more. I imagine that's the way she heard the Japanese language. She's trying to give shelter. It's extraordinary to hear that not metamorph. Well, yeah, I guess it's a metamorphosis. You're hearing this Greek American married to an Italian 30, what was she, 32, 33 during the Butterfly recording. And you are hearing a Japanese geisha who is very, very embarrassed about her wedding night with Pinkerton, despite the fact that they just got married. And she knows what she has to do, but she's still so embarrassed. You can hear her blushing. You can hear her blushing. So we've got the love duet from Butterfly. Because if I had to pick one part of it, at the moment, I would go with that. If you'd asked me a few months ago, I might have offered you Tutu Piccolo Dio, so just before she commits harakiri, or I might have offered you Una Nava Bianca. No, what is it? Una Nava Bianca, the white ship, when she sees Pinkerton coming back. Anyway, I'm going with the love duet from Butterfly at the moment. The death scene from Manon Lescaut. So
Sola perduta abbandonata.
No. What comes afterwards?
Oh, the scene, not the aria.
Not because of Sola perduta abbandonata, which is obviously one of the most popular arias in history, but because of what follows, which is the death scene between Manon. And it sounds the way I think it sounds, but to me, it sounds like she continues to try to seduce Des Grieux even in death. I think it's because Callas found this voice for Manon that sounded very sexual, and that was her greatest asset. I think even more than it was for Carmen. Carmen has a virility, and I worry all about her sexuality because that's almost a gift. Carmen is fearless. Carmen is fearless before death, but Manon Lescaut is just this young poor girl who realized, probably in her late teens or maybe earlier, that her ease of seducing men was so greatest. And it's as if the way Callas finds the voice of this role, it's as if she can't let go of it even in death, because that's innate who she is. So she is singing, her last words are, Ma il mio amor non muore. My love doesn't die. And as her breath runs out, it sounds sexual as well as like death. So it's an erotic death. That's the way I describe it in my book. It's not to say that that's what Maria Callas intended, but I do think that her perception of character spent episodes discussing the fact that no other singer was like Callas, no other singer could characterize like Callas. Somehow she felt, well, this is the voice for Manon. So it doesn't depart just because she's dying, right? Everybody dies differently. Violetta Valéry is going to die. And that's how Manon Lescaut creates a sexual death, even if it's not supposed to, I don't know, maybe that's not what Callas had in mind, but that is who Manon is naturally. That's who she is throughout the Tutu duet with Des Grieux before. She continues being that way. A third recording I would, Qui m'aura dit la place, when Charlotte is reading Werther's letter, which doesn't explicitly say, and the amazing thing about the interpretation of this, from the June 1963 concert, I should add, not from the studio recording of French arias made in Paris, it's as if this is one of those performances where she is simultaneously Charlotte, and she is embodying in her voice Massenet's music, the premonition of Werther's death. Because yes, Charlotte is feeling something is wrong, but can you really argue that Charlotte knows Werther will kill himself? I don't think you can really make that argument entirely, that she absolutely knows. She knows something is wrong. And this is where Callas is really drawing on the orchestral music, particularly the cellos, which are so ominous, with their tremolos they're so dark, especially at the end where she sings, the Werther has written to her, tu frémiras, you will tremble. This is where the character is almost like an omnipotent narrator, where it's like the character knows as much about what's going to happen as the writer of the work did, whether it's Goethe or Massenet. She is embodying everybody who knows what's going to happen.
And in a way, I am happy that it was not me who had to answer that question, because as I was listening to your response, I was thinking to myself, which ones would I choose if I was the one who would be answering the question? I think your three options are Very, very interesting choices. And for my, well, we need to wrap up today's program. And so I would like, Sophia, if you agree, that you could invite the listeners from now 72 countries to invite them to go and read your book.
The Callas Imprint, a Centennial biography, is available on Amazon in all countries where Amazon is. It's available as a paperback in most of those countries, and even as a hardback actually in most of those countries, but the hardback ships from the UK, so it might take longer to arrive. As an ebook, it is available on Amazon, so Kindle, Kobo, Barnes & Noble Nook, Apple Books, and Google Play. If you're in the UK, you can also buy the paperback or the hardback through Waterstones, W.H. Smith, Foyles, and I think that's it.
We're more than willing to build a community of opera lovers. Please visit our profile at buymeacoffee.com. You can find us as Opera in 1P. Yes, all in one word. Opera, then E as in Edward, N as in No, number 1, and P as in Peter. Difficult to catch, right? You can also find it in the description of the episode. We'll be posting there often, so please join us there.